I'm Eric Gilbert from the History Department, and I'd like to thank you all for turning out and not going to watch the debate. But in Arkansas, your vote doesn't count because we know how Arkansas is going to vote. So however you vote will make no difference. So you made a wise choice by coming. Tonight is the first lecture in a series of 4, possibly 5 lectures, all of which concern rice from different angles and perspectives. We have a program going this year called RiziCulture, which is looking at rice both in its sort of technical and biological and cultural aspects. That involves a speaker series, and this is the first event of the speaker series. And paralleling that is a faculty research seminar that includes members of just about every college on campus who are presenting their research to each other and interacting with our visiting speakers and so forth. So we're hoping to have a sort of college-wide initiative looking at and considering rice from a bunch of different angles. And next year we hope to do the same thing with perhaps a different topic to, again, have an interdisciplinary speaker series and research seminar that includes people from all over the campus. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce the first person in this series, Peter Coclanis, who is a historian. I thought we would start with a historian whose work concerns a lot of different things, and I'll sort of take you through some of the things that he's done in his career, which are many and diverse things. But his work is, he's a historian, among other things, of the rice industry in Arkansas and Louisiana. And I was first met him at a rice conference where he gave a paper about the origins of rice farming in Louisiana, and I got sort of interested in that and thought he would make a good sort of kickoff for our program. He is currently the Alfred Ray Newsom Distinguished Professor of History at UNC, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the director of the Global Research Institute. He's an American historian whose original work concerned the rice industry in South Carolina, which is where the rice industry got its start in North America, and he sort of documented its decline in the 19th century. In a book called Shadow of a Dream, Economic Life and Death in the South Carolina Low Country, which came out in 1989. Since starting in South Carolina, he's branched out into looking at global commodity markets and the emergence and the effects of global commodity markets on rice production in the Americas and all kinds of other places. And that research has taken him to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in fact, I learned tonight that he's the only person I've ever met who's been to Burma. And his research has taken him to Burma back in the 90s when nobody went to Burma. And he's made multiple trips to Burma, to, I guess, Thailand, various bits of Southeast Asia. And so he's an American historian who's really branched out into looking at American history from a global perspective. In addition to the book on South Carolina, he's written another book called Time's Arrow, Globalization in Southeast Asia over the Longue Durée, which came out in 2009, and another book, Environmental Change and Agricultural Sustainability in the Mekong Delta, which came out in 2011. In addition to all the scholarly stuff, he's also found time to be a department chair at UNC, where the history department is, I think, bigger than many of our colleges. There are 55 people in the history department at UNC. So it's, I'm sure, a task to keep them all organized and doing things. In addition to that, he's been an associate dean and associate provost. So he's worn a lot of hats in his time. Tonight, he'll be talking to us about the Arkansas Rice Revolution in historical perspective. So please join me in welcoming Peter Coclanis from UNC.
Thank you very much for the generous and gracious introduction. I can't see too well because of the lights, but how many of you are from rice backgrounds somewhere or another? This is great. Usually I'm in a room, I'm the only one who knows or cares anything at all about rice, so this is kind of like bringing coals to Newcastle again. But I'm really pleased to be here tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone at ASU for their gracious hospitality and generosity over the last couple of days. Eric has been a wonderful host, and Dean Laurie Umansky has really stepped up and really played a pivotal role in getting this off the ground along with the other deans, and I think it's a great idea, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here tonight. And I'd like to thank you all because, as Eric said, this is the night of the third debate. I'm an economic historian, and it's a small field, and people always want to know what an economic historian is. And I guess one way to put it is it's a person who likes numbers but lacks sufficient charm, grace, or wit to become an accountant. And I think in some ways that kind of captures my interest. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is a couple of things. I would like to place the Arkansas rice industry into a broader historical frame. And what this entails is really, I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the rice industry in the United States, why the first rice industry in the United States, which was along the South Atlantic coast, failed, and then the unusual set of circumstances that led to the recapitulation and recreation of a rice industry in what was once called the Old Southwest, first in Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas, and a little bit later in East Central Arkansas, and then once it spread to other parts of Arkansas. And the motivation for the talk is something like this. The conventional story of Southern agriculture in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is the key period for the so-called rice revolution in America, if you ask a Southern historian what was Southern agriculture like in this time, and really until the demise of the cotton regime and with the rise of the mechanical cotton picker and its diffusion in the 1950s, you'd say it's backward, retrograde, poor. Income in the overwhelmingly rural South was but half that of the United States as a whole in 1900, and even as late as 1930 was only 51% of the average in the United States as a whole. It was labor intensive, it had very rudimentary technology, populated mainly by poor tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and wage workers. The rice industry, on the other hand, that emerges in the United States, the modern rice industry, that emerges between about 1885 and 1910 in Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Texas, and Arkansas, and a bit later in the Sacramento Valley of California, hardly resembles the stereotypical image of Southern agriculture at the time. And what I'd like to do tonight is to lay out the roots of the difference, and in so doing, to in some ways reinterpret the rice history of the United States. Now, as Eric mentioned at the outset tonight, I've published a good deal on the rice industry in the United States and in Southeast Asia and on the world rice market, and I'm completing a book right now on the world rice trade between about 1700 and 1920, the period in which you see an integrated world market in rice during the first great wave of globalization in the modern world. Now, let me give you a quick run through the early history of the rice industry so that you can get a sense of the profound changes that take place in this part of the world about 110, 120 years ago. The early rice industry in the United States is centered along the South Atlantic coast, in coastal South Carolina, a little later in Georgia as well. It begins in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It spreads to coastal Georgia around 1750 and ultimately extends to the north up to the Cape Fear area of southeastern North Carolina and to the area around the St. Johns River in northeastern Florida. So basically from Florida to North Carolina. The rice production in this area is paddy rice production, first grown on inland swamps and later on tidal rivers. There are about 11 of these main rice rivers in South Carolina and Georgia where most of the rice was grown. A similar type of paddy rice production emerges in Louisiana along the Mississippi River in the antebellum period after about 1800 and going all the way through the Civil War and into the 1870s, 1880s, and even into the 1890s. The type of production in America at this time across the board is very labor intensive in dangerous disease zones, especially malaria. Malaria until the 1930s was a very profound problem in the American South and certainly in these rice zones. There was a great difficulty in recruiting and retaining labor, particularly white labor in these areas, and keeping white laborers alive. And this leads to a decision very early on to turn to African labor and African American labor, and in order to retain this labor, the labor was enslaved very early on. Once this was done, an extremely lucrative plantation-based export rice industry emerges in the first half of the 18th century in South Carolina, from whence it spreads to other parts of the Southeast. By the middle of the 18th century, this area became the West, that is to say, the Western world's largest supplier of rice, with the biggest markets in Northern Europe. South Carolina and Georgia superseded Italy, the Valley of the Upper Po, Piedmont and Lombardy in northwestern Italy is the great rice exporter in the West. Now, there's a big controversy regarding the origins of this early rice industry in the United States, and some of you are probably familiar with the so-called black rice thesis. An eminent geographer from UCLA, Judith Carney, came to ASU 5 or 6, 7 years ago and laid out this thesis. And her work and the work of others who share her view has led to a great deal of attention to this first American rice industry. It's garnered a lot of attention amongst historians who are very prone to kind of accept the view that it was essentially the role and the pivotal role of Africans and later African Americans who developed the technology and techniques upon which the first American rice industry was built. Professor Carney in particular has made the case that the industry was based on the appropriation and expropriation of African knowledge systems regarding rice. And this so-called black rice thesis has gained general acceptance amongst the public and amongst many historians, although not all specialists share the view. And I think we're coming to, we're still it's an unresolved problem about, all of the details, but certainly more and more people think that Africans contributed a lot more to the rice industry than labor alone. This is not the place to go into the controversy in detail, but it has placed rice, I think it's fair to say, on the front burner of Southern agricultural history in recent years. Now, the evolution of the industry. In the conventional story, the South Atlantic rice industry does fine until about the time of the Civil War, which because of the decline of the collapse of slavery and the destruction of rice works during the war, and then later on, because of a series of hurricanes and the Charleston earthquake and a bunch of environmental problems in the coastal South Atlantic area, the industry limps along and collapses by the turn of the century. By around 1900, it's almost, that's its last really big year. Beginning in the late 1980s, after I had finished a book on the South Carolina and Georgia rice industries, I began to question this view in a series of articles and books, pointing to the fact that if one looked closely at the evolution of the rice industry, particularly its competitive position in international markets, one finds that the industry was really in relative decline from the early 19th century on. And by the late antebellum period, well before the Civil War, while slavery still existed in full flower, it had been knocked out of all the leading markets in the world, particularly in Western Europe, and was largely relegated to exporting to slave economies in the Caribbean, particularly Cuba and Puerto Rico. Why? Well, there are some domestic roots, certainly, but mainly because a global market in rice was being created at this very same period during the so-called long 19th century, between around 1789 and 1920 or so. And cheaper, more competitive rice, also paddy rice, first from South Asia and Bengal, and later from Southeast Asia, first from Java, then from Lower Burma, and later on from Siam or Thailand and Cochin, China, which is the southern part of Vietnam, began to undercut more expensive American rice in the leading markets in the world, including markets in the Western world. Both the United States and Asia at the time grew rice in very labor-intensive small paddies with little capital, but Asia did it much more cheaply. Once transportation and communications improvements made it possible to get Asian rice into the West, the US rice industry, or at least the South Atlantic rice industry, was doomed. Now this is the starting point, really, for the story I want to tell tonight. By the 1880s, the old rice industry of the United States along the South Atlantic coast and along the Mississippi River in Louisiana was limping along, if not dying. The US not only had lost its ability to export rice, but had become a significant importer of rice, even with tariff barriers against foreign Asian rice. Dollars to donuts, I would argue that we would have lost the rice industry altogether if not for a very strange convergence, kind of a harmonic convergence of people, interests, and processes in what was then known as the Old Southwest, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, beginning in the mid-1880s. As a result of this convergence, a completely different rice industry soon emerges in the United States, a modern industry, the origins of which were largely Midwestern and white. And it is this story that I'd like to tell tonight. Now, for the most part, many of the main innovations that I'll talk about occur first and in a more aggressive and vigorous pioneering way in southwestern Louisiana and in southeastern Texas. But this story in those areas sets the stage, provides the platform for some of the same developments that emerged slightly later in East Central Arkansas. And much of what I say tonight refers in many ways, sometimes with the same people involved in Arkansas and in Louisiana and in Texas. So let's go into the Rice Revolution story. Now, what I might call, and what some historians of technology call a social assemblage, that is to say, a group of people and institutions come together in southwestern Louisiana in the 1880s to spark the so-called Rice Revolution. And it's very difficult to imagine, much less to conjure up, a weirder group of people or a stranger assemblage or a convergence of people, place, time, market. It's uncanny. For example, what are the chances that a network of Midwestern developers, educators, and agronomists, all of them white and most of them with ties to Iowa, would successfully leverage their own intellectual, financial, and social cultural capital with material resources from investors in the Northeast and in Great Britain, the state of Louisiana, and various and sundry railroads, banks, land development companies, and Louisiana capitalists in such a way as in a few short years to establish a new, dynamic, high-tech rice industry on sparsely settled and scarcely developed lands in Cajun country in southwestern Louisiana, a part of the state inhabited at the time mostly by descendants of French Acadians from the maritime provinces in Canada who had sought refuge in Louisiana after being basically expelled from their homeland by the British after the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century. What are the chances? Minuscule, I would contend, but that's exactly what happened. It's very strange, but alas, true. And if the expansion of the US rice industry onto the prairies of the Old Southwest was perhaps in world historical terms less impressive and important in some ways than the more or less simultaneous expansion of production on various Southeast Asian rice frontiers, which were much larger in size and produced a lot more rice, such as the Irrawaddy Delta in Lower Burma and the Mekong Delta in Indochina, the rice industry that emerges in this part of the world is hardly small potatoes. Now, the expansion of the South has been a constant theme in its history since the 17th century. And the push into what was once called the Old Southwest, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, proved particularly appealing both to planters and to capitalists of one sort or another. And by these, I mean land developers, promoters, railroad men, merchants, etc., beginning in the late antebellum period in the 1840s and 50s. Regarding southwestern Louisiana per se, New Orleans interests, desirous of establishing rail links to Texas, began pushing west in the 1840s, and it actually built a line westward, a railroad line westward into Cajun country well before the Civil War. Dislocations associated with both the war and its aftermath, however, slowed down further expansion, and it's not really until the early 1880s that the line between New Orleans and Houston, essentially, via Orange, Texas on the Sabine River, separating Louisiana from Texas, was actually completed. Now, once such links were established, development of some sort in the swamplands and the desolate prairies of southwest Louisiana became a realistic possibility for the first time, as actors of various kinds, far and wide, were quick to note. Corporations, the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Southwest Immigration Company, and a British entity, a kind of infamous entity called the North American Land and Timber Company, took the lead early on. They were aided and abetted in this project by officials from the state of Louisiana itself, which obviously was looking to promote development in a remote section of the state, along with a colorful cast of promoters, entrepreneurs, and agronomists, as well as assorted hustlers and flim-flam men. And truth be told, the above efforts met with considerable success, as South Central and Southwestern Louisiana began to attract migrants from other parts of Louisiana, mostly whites, but some African Americans, and from other states, along with some foreign immigrants as well. The leading promoters of Southwest Louisiana in the 1880s, particularly of its agricultural development, constituted a triumvirate of Midwesterners. Three in particular I'm going to focus on tonight: Sylvester Carey, Jabez Watkins, and Seaman Knapp. Now, some of these names are probably familiar with you, particularly the last. They sometimes collaborated on settlement and development schemes. At other times, they pursued parallel projects. At still other times, they found themselves competing directly with one another. What makes them interesting for our purposes was the degree to which they shared the same networks that would ultimately prove central to the rice revolution that I'm going to be talking about. All three of these men had close connections to Iowa. Carey, a native Iowan, took up work as an immigration agent and land developer in southwestern Louisiana in the early 1880s, supposedly seeking, quote, a home from where there was neither winter nor mortgages, end quote. If we take him at his word, the fact that he teamed up at times with Watkins was in some ways ironic. For Watkins, who is something of a George Babbitt type, was a land speculator, a farm mortgage broker, and a developer par excellence, whose business practices over the years were, shall we say, not without controversy. Working mainly out of Kansas in the early 1880s, when his interest in Texas and Louisiana began to heat up, he, along with his affiliates at a branch office he had established in London, England, organized the North American Land and Timber Company in the UK, which company quickly raised sufficient capital to acquire huge amounts of undeveloped land in southwestern Louisiana. When it came time to recruit settlers to the area and to develop the lands he had acquired, Watkins turned for help to his brother-in-law, a guy named Alexander Thompson, who was teaching agriculture at the Iowa Agricultural College, which is now known as Iowa State University, in Ames. His interest peaked, Thompson agreed to help promote agricultural development in Louisiana, and more importantly, as it turned out, he enticed Seaman Knapp, one of his colleagues at the Iowa Agricultural College, indeed at the time president of the place, to join him in his promotional efforts in Louisiana. In many ways, Knapp was the key node in the complex overlapping information, technology, and innovation networks that were, in my view, both necessary and sufficient to explain the rice revolution in the Old Southwest. Not only was he an agronomist and later breeder of note, but he was also an agricultural journalist. He edited the Western Stock Journal and Farmer out of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which was the progenitor to the famous agricultural journal Wallace's Farmer. In addition, he played a leading role in the movement in the 1880s to establish a government-funded agricultural experiment system of stations, which movement finally reached fruition with the passage of the Hatch Act of 1887. Knapp's range of contacts inside and outside of Iowa was broad and deep. He was close friends, for example, with James Tama Jim Wilson, a Scot who, after migrating to Iowa as a young man, became a powerful political figure in the Hawkeye State before serving as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture between 1897 and 1913. It should be noted that Wilson, while Secretary of Agriculture, appointed Knapp, quote-unquote, agricultural explorer for the USDA and sent him on 2 long and ultimately very successful trips to Asia in 1898 and 1901 in search of better varieties of rice and other cultigens. It should be noted as well that Wilson, like Knapp and like Alexander Thompson, was at various points a professor of agriculture at Iowa State. Wheels within wheels, in other words. Iowa State figures very heavily. Just parenthetically, George Washington Carver, the peanut man, also did his graduate work at the time at Iowa State. Now, Knapp's contacts transcended the worlds of commerce, education, and government, pushing into the spiritual realm as well. He was a Methodist minister and spent 2 years as pastor of a rural church in Vinton, Iowa, interacting closely with the types of Protestant farmers who came to constitute the Midwestern migrant pool to southwestern Louisiana and later to southeastern Texas and to Arkansas. Indeed, Knapp, Carey, Watkins, and other promoters of southwest Louisiana worked faith communities in the rural Midwest assiduously and aggressively and successfully when in their attempts to promote migration south. They worked these communities and others by tapping old and creating new information networks in very energetic and enterprising ways. Once the railroad opened up southwest Louisiana, and individual and corporate promoters acquired vast chunks of marshland and prairie land in the region, dirt cheap, I might add, the trio began to settle and develop this land. Employing an impressive array of marketing strategies and tactics, circulars, pamphlets, planted newspaper articles, lectures and testimonials, free sightseeing tours, farm inspection trips, etc., agents representing railroads, land companies, syndicates, and of course themselves on the side, enticed thousands of Midwestern farmers from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Missouri, and Kansas to the Old Southwest. Between 1880 and 1900, the population of southwest Louisiana, and I'll define it broadly as the Cajun parts of southern Louisiana, basically between Baton Rouge and the Texas line, grew rapidly, with the southwestern prairie parishes in particular almost doubling. To be sure, much of the population growth was due to newcomers from more settled parts of Louisiana, particularly in the east. But a critical part was comprised of expectant corn and wheat belt farmers, fleeing low commodity prices, snow, blizzards, and droughts, and hopeful of finding something better in the south. And the rapid populating of both the marshlands and the fertile but desolate prairie lands by white emigres from the Midwest was due in large part to the success of these communication and information nodes, to use the language of social network analysis, such as Knapp, Carey, and Watkins, whose networks in the heartland of America were widespread and distinct, even if they partially overlapped like Venn diagrams. They had a lot of connections, but they also were sufficiently distinct from one another to really expand the size of these networks dramatically. In some ways, the fact that their networks were only loosely linked may even have been advantageous. In this regard, one thinks some of you might know of the sociologist Mark Granovetter's famous strength of weak ties formulation, which seems appropriate in attempting to explain the successful colonization of the predominantly Catholic Cajun country of southwest Louisiana in the 1880s and 90s by Protestant farmers from the Midwest as the loosely aligned micro networks of the aforementioned three promoters concatenated really into a major macro development, the demographic and economic transformation of southwest Louisiana and from there to Texas and Arkansas. Although the demographic reconstitution of this region by Midwesterners was the result of well-laid plans and considerable coordination, its economic reconstitution was anything but. That is to say, as the migration of the Midwest, from the Midwest began to take off in the early 1880s, few of the early migrants coming down, however entrepreneurial and commercially minded that they might be, explicitly did so in order to grow rice. Like the region itself, this cereal first had to be sold, and its sale owed much to many, none more so than Seaman Knapp. After an initial fact-finding visit to the area, Knapp moved with his family to southwest Louisiana in November 1885. He did so, as suggested earlier, at the behest of Alexander Thompson, who had recruited him to work for his brother-in-law, Jabez Watkins, whose huge development syndicate, the North American Land and Timber Company, had recently acquired about 1.5 million acres of land in the region. Settling originally in the newly established town of Lake Charles, Knapp, as the well-paid assistant manager of the syndicate, was tasked with two related but nonetheless distinct responsibilities. First, recruitment of hardworking, commercially minded Midwestern farmers to the area, and with a nod to his expertise and experience in agronomy, to find a crop or crops with profit potential for those recruited to the region's marshes and prairie lands. Until the 1880s, indeed even afterwards, the largely Cajun population that was indigenous to the area, or at least that was living there for a couple hundred years, in the marshes practiced subsistence agriculture, hunted and fished, and grazed livestock where they could. In limited ways, the prairies, which were kind of away from the coastland, were also sites of subsistence agriculture and cattle grazing. That is, when they were put into any productive use at all, and much of this land was not used by the Euro-American settlers in any productive way. Given the area's remoteness and lack of access to centers of trade, it is clear that the latter activity, meat on the hoof as it were, ranching activities, offered the small population living on the prairies, particularly on the western prairies, its best and perhaps only chance effectively to participate in market exchange of any kind. But with the coming of the railroad and a series of river dredging products and port improvements successfully advanced by Watkins and his allies, other economic options first became possible, including for the first time commercial agriculture. In essence, then, what we are witnessing in the region is an attempt by Midwestern business interests and corporations to transform agriculture, subsistence agriculture, along large-scale capitalist lines. So alluring was the portrait of southwest Louisiana painted by promoters, or conversely, so poor did prospects at home seem to farmers from the Corn Belt and the Wheat Belt in the 1880s, that many rural Midwesterners quit the most fertile farmland in the U.S., and in so doing left behind kith and kin for the chance to break largely untilled prairie soil and attempt to start anew in Louisiana. At first, most believed they would be able to cultivate the same crops that they had at home, but when they did, they failed to do so profitably, which put promoters such as Knapp in a real fix. The region had been touted in the overhyped advertising language of the time in Edenic terms as a land, if not of milk and honey, then of various and sundry field crops, livestock, fruit and vegetables, any of all of which, it was said, would render farmers prosperous, if not rich. Fairly quickly, though, it began to dawn on the newcomers that from the north that neither of the principal Midwestern mainstays, wheat or corn, did very well in southwest Louisiana. As Knapp and the other promoters, along with the migrants themselves, began to acclimate to the region, however, they took note of the fact that a crop with which they were unfamiliar, rice, was being grown in small quantities by many Cajun farmers in the marshlands and on the prairies. The crop seemed to do well in the humid subtropical climate of southwest Louisiana, even though it was cultivated without benefit, really, of modern irrigation techniques dependent solely on rainwater impounded by in rudimentary reservoirs. Such dependence led the Cajuns to call what they were growing Providence rice. It was basically dependent on the providence of God to make rain fall. The similarities between rice and wheat quickly registered with both Knapp and the Midwestern migrants. One didn't have to teach agriculture at Iowa State to recognize that rice and wheat are both cereal grasses with some, but not all, of the same cultivation characteristics. Given the commercial bent of both the promoters and the migrants, the failed experiments with other field crops, and the paucity of alternatives, interest in rice cultivation soon took off. Not only did Knapp set up demonstration farms upon which rice and other crops were grown, but many of the migrants, particularly those with previous experience in wheat, also began experimenting with rice cultivation and using, in so doing, Midwestern wheat production methods and Midwestern wheat production technology. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, for various matters relating to soil and water had to be addressed in conjunction with those relating to cultivation technology. If they weren't addressed successfully, any attempts at technological transfer on the prairies of southwest Louisiana, however effective, wouldn't be worth a hill of beans. First, soil. Both Knapp and the other newcomers experimenting with rice quickly found that although the heavy silt and sandy soils on the prairies were very different than those that they were used to in the Midwest, they were well suited for rice cultivation. Why? Basically because they were fertile, but it was the virtual impenetrability of their subsoil hardpans that allowed these soils to hold and retain water almost indefinitely, or at least for long periods of time. If adequate water resources were found to be available, and if appropriate water control or irrigation works could be put into place, these soils clearly promised much. And so agricultural trials were soon mounted with various sources of water for irrigation. Even prior to Knapp's entrance on the scene, several elaborate exercises in water control and capital-intensive cultivation were attempted by the Watkins Syndicate in southwest Louisiana, not on the prairie per se, but on the marshlands in Cameron Parish near the coast. These schemes involved not only large-scale land reclamation, dredging, and canal construction, but also complicated, indeed overly complicated technology. For example, barges mounted with engines aligned with one another in parallel canals as much as a half a mile apart, pulled by cables connected to heavy agricultural equipment, which in theory would allow highly efficient gang plowing, seeding, cultivating, harvesting, etc., by boat. Such efforts in retrospect always had something of a Rube Goldberg air about them and never amounted to much. They do, however, presage the capital-intensive turn agriculture in this area soon would take. As Knapp himself later pointed out, the rice revolution as a revolution in southwest Louisiana started with simpler methods of water control, mainly consisting of modest piecemeal improvements in earlier reservoir impoundment systems associated with Providence rice and in simple irrigation schemes. According to Knapp, I quote, "Wherever prairies were found sufficiently level, generally with slopes of less than 1 degree, with an intersecting creek which could be used to flood them, they were surrounded by a small levee. These levees were usually 12 to 24 inches high, and the interior ditch was 12 to 18 inches deep and 4 or 5 feet wide," end quote. This was basically it at first. Water from the adjacent creeks was drawn onto and off of the fields, but very few interior ditches were made, and little attention was paid to drainage. Impoundment reservoirs continued in use, but in times of drought, creeks failed, and reservoirs were found to be expensive and unreliable. Over time, but not much time, in the 1890s, more sophisticated irrigation works powered by windmills, steam engines, or gas turbines were erected by growers and enterprisers with support and encouragement from the likes of Knapp, Watkins, and Carey, and they had begun to establish private canal and irrigation companies in the rice region, which developed elaborate water control and pumping schemes and protocols specifically for the upland prairies. Custom pumping outfits could soon be rented out by growers, and such outfits helped to regularize and routinize irrigation and field drainage. Moreover, by 1895 or so, water engineers had discovered that the prairie was underlain by huge underground reservoirs of water in strata anywhere from 125 to 600 feet beneath the surface, which made it possible almost immediately via pipe wells, engines, and pumping systems to grow irrigated rice far removed from rivers, bayous, and streams. Talk about providence. Sophisticated water pumping schemes would later come to embody rice cultivation in the Old Southwest, as all of you in Arkansas know, as much or more than anything else, with the possible exception of the region's almost impossibly high degree of mechanization and capital intensity. And as was the case with water control, with respect to methods and cultivation technology, such tendencies were evident early on to Midwestern migrants in pursuit of the main chance, as they worked to make of Southwest Louisiana an improved version of the agricultural lands in the Midwest they left behind. Knapp tellingly likened the rice fields of Southwest Louisiana in the 1880s and 1890s to the bonanza wheat farms of Dakota, the huge, heavily mechanized wheat-producing domains that sprung up in the upper Great Plains beginning in the 1870s. These domains, which were essentially Midwestern latifundia, arose for much the same reasons as the rice farms further south: the presence of aggressive promoters and entrepreneurs, the ready availability of abundant, cheap, fertile land, new types of labor-saving farm equipment and implements, adequate stocks of harvest labor, the completion of railroad lines through the region, ready access to modern milling facilities and markets. Although the farms on the rice prairies weren't nearly so large as the bonanza wheat farms, one such farm in North Dakota stretched to 100,000 acres in the 1870s, which is about 7 times the size of Manhattan Island. Another was over 60,000 acres, and a number were over 15,000, and the average size, by which we mean here, was about 7,000 acres. The migrant farmers in Southwest Louisiana, however, took their cue from these bonanza farms and were just as eager to mechanize as were their brethren further north. And they were going to employ, after adaptation, one part of the indigenous knowledge system they already knew well, wheat cultivating machinery, in so doing. Thus, we find that adjustments were quickly made to familiar equipment used in wheat cultivation: gang plows, disc harrows, drills, broadcast seeders, and the like, in order to render such equipment suitable for rice. One important implement proved somewhat difficult to adapt to rice, however, and that was the twine binder. Even so, by 1884, one of the entrepreneurial Midwestern farmers who had migrated to the area, an Iowan named Maurice Bryan, who had settled in the new town of Jennings, Louisiana, of which town Sylvester Carey is considered the father, had succeeded in adapting a Deering binder for use with rice. After a few years, the Deering Company was flooding Southwest Louisiana with rice binders from its factory in Illinois. By the early 1890s, steam tractors, which were widely deployed in the Great Plains and in the far west as early as the 1870s, and threshers were also in use in rice. And this was the case nowhere else in the world did this kind of technology find use in the rice industry. And by then, just a few short years after the rice revolution in Southwest Louisiana had begun, and before the irrigation systems were really very far along in the region, Louisiana had already leapfrogged South Carolina to become the predominant rice producer by far in the United States. Moreover, by the end of the 1880s, Southwest Louisiana already accounted for a sizable share of the rice produced in the state of Louisiana, with Acadia Parish, whose seat Crawley was to become a major milling center, producing more rice than any other parish in Louisiana. The share of the state's rice emanating from Southwest Louisiana would increase dramatically during the 1890s, so that by the turn of the century, the amount produced in the region totally dwarfed production produced elsewhere in the state. Even using a very narrow definition of Southwest Louisiana, by 1899 crop year, about 3/4 of all rice in Louisiana was produced there. On the Southwest Louisiana prairies, which extend westward from St. Landry, St. Martin parishes all the way to the Texas border, rice production began to take on something of a standard cast, really, or form by the late 1890s. And this form basically is the template for Arkansas and for Texas as well. Sizable land holdings, some of which were thousands of acres in size, operated by big companies or owner-operators, often divided into tenant farms worked by relatively affluent tenants who owned a good deal of expensive equipment. Large rice fields of 60 to 80 acres or even more, rather than tiny paddies. Irrigation via water pumped from streams and bayous by farm owners or canal companies, or via pump wells scattered through the fields. Capital-intensive cultivation, mainly with heavily mechanized wheat technology adapted for use in rice. Harvesting and threshing with self-binders and steam threshers. Labor provided mainly by owner-operators and/or tenants, with some casual labor, mostly white, especially in Arkansas, with some African Americans, particularly in Southwest Louisiana, used seasonally, particularly during the harvest. This cast was not what we would call modern by today's standards, but it was a far cry from the labor-intensive methods used in rice cultivation in the South Atlantic states or on the Mississippi River in Louisiana, or indeed anywhere else in the world at the time. Rice was well on its way to becoming wheat, as it were. Now, given the characteristics outlined above, it's not surprising that once the irrigation works were in place, the labor inputs for cultivating prairie rice were minimal in comparison to rice cultivation regimes anywhere else in the world. At the peak of the rice industry in the South Atlantic states, that is South Carolina and Georgia, for example, one slave hand, calculations went, was needed to produce 5 or 6 acres of rice plus an acre of food crops. By the late 19th century, this acreage figure had increased slightly, and it was estimated that one rice worker in South Carolina or Georgia, devoting his or her efforts solely to rice, could cultivate 8 acres. Compare this to the situation on the mechanized prairies of Southwest Louisiana, where in 1900, one worker with a team of mules could cultivate 80 to 100 acres of rice, except during the harvest when an additional worker was needed. Weeding requirements were minimal on the prairies because of irrigation and because winter crops were often cultivated on the rice fields, which limited further weed growth. And mechanical reapers and binders meant that there was no need for laborious hand harvesting via rice hooks and sickles. In contrast, at roughly the same time, for example, in Italy, tens of thousands of weeders, mainly females working for wages, were employed each year in the Italian rice industry during the growing season, and that was the biggest competitor in Europe. And the harvest proved hugely labor-intensive in almost every rice-producing area elsewhere in the world. Thus, turning rice into wheat, so to speak, drastically reduced labor inputs. By 1910, on the Grand Prairie in east central Arkansas, the amount of rice land that one worker could tend had grown to 200 acres, with a bit of additional hired labor for shocking and thrashing, as they called it, and rice people began to think not in terms of man-days per acre, but man-hours per acre. This said, one thing the rice revolution did not lead to, at least at first, was spectacular increases in yields. Indeed, although yields on the prairies of Southwest Louisiana, which at the time in terms of clean rice were about 800 to 1,000 pounds per acre, were considerably higher than yields in the collapsing rice industry in the South Atlantic region during that period, they were generally much lower than was the case in the small and sometimes tiny non-mechanized paddy fields in Italy, East Asia, and even Southeast Asia. During this period, they were even lower than in Lower Burma, whose expanding but still rudimentary rice frontier complex was marked by farms much larger than in other parts of Asia. These results regarding yields aren't really surprising, however. Indeed, they hardly surprised contemporaries in Southwest Louisiana or in Arkansas at the time. In most cultivation schemes, rice yields, all things being equal, will increase with greater labor intensity, at least up to a certain point. And labor inputs were minimized in the rice production function in Southwest Louisiana. Indeed, the whole rice production system on the prairies was designed to minimize relatively scarce, relatively expensive labor, and to maximize the amount of relatively cheap land each laborer could tend. Initially, land was exceedingly cheap on the marshlands and on the prairies of the Old Southwest. Sometimes it was even free, but generally as little as 20 to 50 cents an acre in the 1880s. And U.S. Department of Agriculture data on wages for rice workers around the world in this period, compiled by none other than the ubiquitous Seaman Knapp, demonstrate that daily farm wages with board in Southwest Louisiana and Texas at $1.50 or $2 a day were far higher than any place else in the world at the time. But on the rice prairies, each laborer worked roughly 80 acres of rice, while outside the United States, the largest average figure for acreage tended was 5 acres per worker, and that was in Egypt and Spain, where daily wages with board were between 30 and 50 cents US. So the calculation is that even with the relatively expensive labor in the Southwest, the amount of land that could be tended was so great that it more than made up for the small increase in wages. The relatively small size of labor inputs, coupled with the cheap price of land, rendered the rice industry in the Old Southwest quite profitable in the period from its beginnings until World War I, despite its capital intensity, its so-so yields, and the low rice prices in the United States between 1890 and 1914. Abstracting a bit, one can in some ways view the seismic shift of the U.S. rice industry from the South Atlantic states to the Old Southwest as a market response to the creation of an integrated world market in rice, which process was nearing completion during the same period. As low-cost rice from Asia increasingly dominated markets the world over, labor-intensive rice production in the South Atlantic region of the United States, even with rapidly increasing tariff protection, was doomed. The revolutionary new regime established in the Old Southwest, beginning in Southwest Louisiana and moving to Texas and Arkansas in the first decade of the 20th century, at least gave the U.S. industry a chance, a fighting chance at that. After World War I, the revolutionized American rice industry, benefiting from impressive productivity gains, the rapid growth of commercial rice production in California, and tariffs on foreign rice, regained control of the domestic market, and the U.S. became a net exporter once again. And to reiterate, the revolutionaries were first and foremost promoters, entrepreneurs, and commercially minded farmers from the Midwest. To attribute the revolution primarily to Midwesterners is in no way to imply that locals were against modernizing agriculture, much less anti-revolutionary. After all, Louisiana's capital-intensive and intensively capitalistic sugar industry was being modernized in much the same way at roughly the same time by locals. Nor is attributing the rice revolution primarily to Midwesterners to deny that locals and non-locals from places other than the Midwest played roles as well, sometimes important roles. Locals, generally speaking, welcomed the newcomers and both appreciated and supported their developmental initiatives. Despite the usual business spats, native bankers and millers and merchants, especially in New Orleans, provided investment capital and processed and marketed a good deal of the revolutionary rice. Moreover, some immigrants, most notably a guy named Abram Kaplan, who migrated from Poland in 1890 and settled improbably enough in the prairie rice town of Crowley, Louisiana, founded in 1886, were to prove crucial in many important ways to the rice revolution. In his case, Kaplan quickly got involved in rice growing and especially in rice milling in southwest Louisiana, and later in 1902 founded a town in Vermilion Parish, which he called, not surprisingly, Kaplan. Others in his family soon followed him to the area, also from Poland, and got involved in major ways in the rice industry. Immigrants, one should note, played important roles in the early development of the rice industry in Arkansas and Texas as well, albeit often after spending time in the U.S. For example, here's one of these bringing coals to Newcastle statements. The town of Stuttgart in Arkansas County, often considered the capital of the rice industry in America, was founded in the early 1880s by Adam Burkel, a native of essentially Baden-Württemberg in Germany, who was a Lutheran minister who promoted the migration of German immigrant farmers from the Midwest to the Grand Prairie region of Arkansas. Taking its name from the capital of the state from which he migrated, Stuttgart was incorporated in 1884 and soon became the marketing center for farmers in the Grand Prairie, where rice took off in a serious way in the first decade of the 20th century. But when all is said and done, it was not Poland or Germany, but the Midwest that begat this revolution, and white Midwestern farmers, whether native or migrants, and their heavily commercialized values and culture that made this revolution. It was theirs. For every town of Kaplan or Stuttgart, there was an Iowa, which is in southwest Louisiana, or a Vinton, also in southwest Louisiana, named by Knapp after the Iowa town where he had preached, or a Jennings, which is known even today as a northern village on southern soil. To the names Knapp, Carey, and Watkins, we could add Midwesterners such as W.H. Fuller, who is from Ohio and Nebraska, John Morris from Nebraska, albeit born in Wales, and W.E. Hope from Missouri, who are essentially the founders of the rice industry in Arkansas, as well as that of the leading chronicler of the early rice industry in Arkansas, J.M. Spicer, a native of Ohio, who made rice crops in the Stuttgart area for 55 consecutive years, or excuse me, 51 consecutive years beginning in 1916. One contemporary put the number of Midwesterners in southwest Louisiana, Midwestern farmers, at 7,000. And a survey of Arkansas rice farmers in 1930 found that 75% were born out of state, 60% in the states of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri alone. The vision S.L. Carey had articulated in an 1898 promotional piece entitled A Paradise for the Immigrant was in fact largely fulfilled. Here's what Carey said in that pamphlet. In all frankness, we want the best farmers of the North. We have succeeded remarkably with such as we can get, such often who had made failures in the North, who had experimented too long with the long winter. We shall not go to Europe or to Africa, and will find them at home as soon as they learn the facts as they exist. So he was very cognizant of the fact that it was these Midwesterners who brought the revolution south. The Midwestern farmers who established the rice industry as an industry in the Old Southwest were cut from the same commercial cloth or mold as the people they left behind. That is to say, the people who would bring us the Farm Bureau, which was established in Illinois in 1919, and the Hybrid Seed Company, later Pioneer, established in Iowa in 1926. They were of the same stock as the Iowa farmers who embraced the above-named seed company's great innovation, hybrid corn, so rapidly in the 1930s, the rapidity of which embrace was demonstrated and accounted for so powerfully in a classic 1957 paper in the journal Econometrica. Although high-yielding rice hybrids were not developed until much later in the 1960s and 70s, the delay was due in large part to the fact that heterosis or hybrid vigor was much more difficult to achieve in rice than in corn. Like their brethren further north, the Midwesterners who established the rice industry in the Old Southwest were from the start avid about improved seed varieties, which they sought by various means. After many years of disinterest or neglect by scholars, the history of biological innovation in American agriculture, including seed breeding, is finally getting more play, in large part because of the work of economic historians Alan Olmsted and Paul Rohde, whose award-winning 2008 book, Creating Abundance: Biological Innovation in American Agricultural Development, has already had a large impact. In their book, Olmsted and Rohde argue convincingly that in explaining American agricultural development, economic historians and historians of technology have paid far too much attention to labor-saving mechanical technology and insufficient attention to biological innovation. According to Olmsted and Rohde, this problem is especially pronounced in explanations of American agricultural development in the 2 centuries before World War II. In making their case for the importance of biological innovation, they marshal a huge array of evidence regarding productivity gains emanating from increasingly systematic and increasingly successful innovations in plant and animal breeding over the centuries. In so doing, putting a lie to the widely held notion that biological innovation in American agriculture began in the 1920s. In Iowa, one should note, with Henry Wallace and the Hybrid Seed Company, and didn't amount to much until the advent of hybrid corn in the 1930s. To be sure, Olmsted and Rohde may overstate slightly the degree to which other scholars have neglected biological innovation, but their overall point is well taken. Although they don't treat rice per se in creating abundance, it is clear that from the historical evidence, at least that from the Old Southwest, that their thesis is very well put. Virtually from the start, agronomists working either privately or at state experiment stations and growers in Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, etc., were interested in improved varieties. And in the period between 1900 and 1929, 10 new rice cultivars were developed in Louisiana and Texas, including important ones such as the regional bellwether Blue Rose, a durable medium grain rice developed by the famous Crawley, Louisiana rice farmer Sol Wright, who is sometimes known as the Luther Burbank of the rice industry. Wright, almost predictably, was a Midwesterner, born in Indiana, and a former wheat farmer before moving just outside of Crawley in Acadia Parish in 1890 to try his hand at growing rice. Some of the other rice cultivars that became popular in the Old Southwest were imports, most notably Honduran, the long grain variety introduced in 1890, and so-called Kyusha or Jap rices, as they're sometimes known, the short grains introduced to the region by Seaman Knapp in 1902 after the second of his bioprospecting tours of Asia as agricultural explorer for the USDA. Clearly then, the principals involved in the early rice industry in the Old Southwest were interested in biological as well as mechanical innovation, and some of the cultivars they developed, especially Wright's Blue Rose and some of his later varieties, such as Early Prolific, brought in both improved yields and reduced losses in the milling process. They were interested in as well in creating the organizational, marketing, and educational infrastructure and capabilities appropriate for a modern scientific industry. From modest beginnings, such as Knapp's demonstration farms in the 1880s, the rice industry's infrastructural portfolio soon included agricultural experiment stations and private breeding farms, a specialized journal, the Rice Journal and Gulf Farmer, published out of Crawley beginning in 1897, co-ops and trade associations of various kinds, the earliest of which, the Farmers Cooperative Rice Milling Company and the Rice Association of America, were both the handiwork of Seaman Knapp in the 1890s. The modern scientific and ultra-capitalist form of rice farming outlined above soon carried the day throughout the Old Southwest and shortly thereafter in the emerging California rice complex centered in the Sacramento Valley. It has dominated the American rice industry ever since, nowhere more so than in the Grand Prairie of Arkansas. It's a long way from here to there, but the roots of the hyper-capital intensive, exceptionally efficient agricultural ricescape on the Grand Prairie today near places such as Stuttgart, for example, are to be found in southwest Louisiana in the late 19th century. People from the same Midwestern stock and much the same mentalities that brought the steam tractor and modified mechanical reapers and binders to Crowley and Jennings in the 1890s are responsible for the rice cultivation regime on the Grand Prairie in 2012. A regime, as all of you in this room know, that is characterized by, the most advanced agricultural technology in the world, including, satellites connected to the USDA's soil tilth lab located in, yes, Ames, Iowa, and massive water pumping stations interspersed in the rice fields, etc. If one by chance finds himself in the Stuttgart area in the summer months, as you all know, mosquitoes will be abundant, but humans scarce. For during the growing season, one farmer can essentially tend 1,000 acres on the rice prairies. The system that exists in Arkansas today began to take shape 125 years ago, an early manifestation of the quote-unquote indigenous knowledge system brought south by white Protestant developers and farmers from the Midwest in search of economic salvation. Whether or not America's first RiziCultural regimes were African in inspiration remains an open question, but the origins of modern rice cultivation in the United States were without a doubt Midwestern and white. Thank you. That's it. If there's time, I'm happy to answer questions. If I can see anyone. It's hard to see. Oh, okay.
I just think that Bill Fine is studying the names of farming and also the story of the Open Ridge cattle industry. And ultimately, in those two cases, at least in the older economic historical story, it's reversion to economies of scale. The things are much too large and eventually have to be downsized to be truly efficient and effectively profitable. Is there a similar story in rice cultivation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly these bonanza farms had a limited shelf life, and by 1900 most of them had failed. They were too big, too much capital intensity, too hard to retain labor and things like that. And the question is the same thing happen in rice? I don't think it happens in the same way. For one thing, while there was a similar trajectory, the rice farms were never anywhere near as large as some of the larger bonanza farms. And I think that they generally hit a level of scale that could be sustained. Even today, many, as you know better than I, a good number of rice farmers tend several thousand acres in the state and seem to do so, with relative efficiency. So I think economies of scale in the case of the rice production technology and the platform that's put into place in this period was more sustainable economically. Now, whether or not it's more sustainable over the long haul environmentally is another question, and that's something I think many rice planters and farmers and rice scholars are dealing with, not only in this part of the world, but even more particularly in California right now, where the Sacramento Valley area and the Imperial Valley or the Central Valley are the long-term viability is questioned. About 25% of the entire, as you know, water in the Colorado River is going to those two counties, a couple of counties in California, and whether that is sustainable without either a whole new pricing system or a whole different technology, or whether or not rice should be grown in a place like Sacramento Valley is a good question. But I think the economic viability of the farms of the size and scale that ultimately emerge in Louisiana and certainly in Arkansas is sustainable, and we've seen the sustainability over 100 years. Yeah.
Can you contrast the values and cultures of the Midwestern rice farmers that you described to the let's say, the cotton planters of East Arkansas and the Delta and the Old South?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was where I think the implication is where the values all that different. And I would argue that, and I'm one that does argue and has argued for a long time, that the problem has never been in southern agriculture amongst the commercially viable cotton farmers in the South. Has never been a lack of market orientation or a lack of entrepreneurship, but a particular structure of opportunity in the South. So I don't think that cotton farmers in the South were necessarily anti-capitalistic, weren't entrepreneurial, weren't aggressive. There was a different structure of opportunity emerging in cotton and in rice by the late 19th century. There were never, according to most scholars, significant economies of scale in cotton production in the South at any period, really, until the 20th century. There were, pretty early on, it was apparent in rice. So you get a different kind of size threshold in rice, really, from the 18th century on. And in both the older rice regime and in the newer rice regime, I think you attract a certain type of farmer who has either his own or her own resources or ability to tap into capital to allow for a much greater size and scale. And you get a somewhat different profile of a typical rice farmer in America, either in the old regime or the new regime, than in cotton. Cotton has a wide gamut in the Old South and the New South of size and scale. Even amongst slave holdings in the South, in 1860, in the Cotton South, the modal number of slaves held was 1. 3/4 of white free families had no slaves in 1860. Only 3% of white families, free families, were planter families. In rice, around 60% of the rice holdings in South Carolina, Georgia were planters. So you have a different scale of production early on, and with the scale came, I think, a different commitment and ability to operate in a large-scale capitalist commercial environment. But it's a good question. You don't have in rice these very, very small scratch holdings that you have in cotton in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It's a whole different profile. Even today, there's never been a lot of rice farmers in the Old Southwest, while there were, millions of small cotton farmers, scratch farmers with basically retrograde production technology in much of the South until 1960s, basically. There's another question behind you, I think. No, same side of it.
Would you comment, please, sir, on the impact of the farm subsidy on consumer prices and how the relativity of that could be explained?
Today or historically?
Today.
I'm not, one could argue all day about farm subsidies and, the stalled farm bill. I personally am not, I don't think in general the farm subsidy problem hurts America very much. We pay, if you look at the amount of our basically per capita income, household income that's going to foodstuffs, I think it's about 8% on prepared foods and about 5% if you include restaurant foods. So it's about 13% of American household income goes to food, which is by far the lowest proportion of any developed country in the world, and some would argue any country in the world at all. And so while one can quibble and one can make political hay at times about these subsidies, I think that for better or worse, it's produced a system that has effects that are not deleterious to the 310 million Americans who are not farmers. So, the small number of farmers who are getting these subsidies, it doesn't, I don't get that worked up about it. And I don't think in the long run that it's a major drain on them.
It would be a zero-sum situation, if not a transfer payment to social structure.
Pardon?
It seems that it would be a zero sum in the subsidy of the farm program, in the distribution in the agriculture department through a food program. And that therefore it might be a transfer payment.
Yeah, it could. I mean, there are other ways to work it. But I don't get personally worked up about the subsidy program as it existed. It's irrational in many ways. It's, there are certain crops that get different treatment than other crops. Some are left out. Half of it is going to basically urban consumers. But I think in the long run, I think there is a danger, I think, of taking some of the underpinnings out of an agricultural system in the United States, which I think is probably, in my view, the best in the world. I'm kind of a fan of American agriculture, unlike some people. I mean, the way it's developed.
Have any of the sort of technologies and approaches to rice farming that were developed in this area, which seem to be kind of unique in the world, have there been efforts to adapt those technologies in other, is it Australia or China or? Australia
in particular uses, at least until the recent droughts, has adapted some of the same technologies in some of the most capital-intensive rice areas in Australia. But the whole rice industry in Australia is up into question because of its massive use of water today. So a lot of people are disinvesting in agriculture, in rice. But Australia is the place that has adopted the technology in the most similar way. There's a lot of very interesting technology, but it's not the same that is used in Japan. But these are for micro farms and very expensive, well-calibrated, technologically sophisticated equipment, but it is very small scale equipment made for small rice farms. So China is now having a debate about whether or not they need to consolidate both wheat and rice farms, these small landholdings, into large units and then replicate some of the American experience. But I think most people think that China's comparative advantage anymore is not in rice or wheat, where there are other places that can produce it easier and cheaper and have much more water to do so than China. But they are certainly investigating what we do. They're very interested in genetic modification and biological innovation, and also in perhaps replicating the American experience of scale and scope. But Australia's been the only one that has done anything remotely like what we have. Well, Therese.
What was the impact of the Smith-Weaver Act on rice production in Arkansas, particularly with the creation of agricultural experiment stations and proliferation of extension agents? What impact did they have, or did they have any impact at all?
Oh, it certainly has an impact, and it's part of a whole what I would call kind of state capacity building in agriculture in the United States and in other parts of the world between 1890 and 1920, when we begin to get a much more research-intensive agricultural regime and a kind of biological revolution in American agriculture. And agriculture is moving to a whole entirely new age, and in some ways, the agricultural state apparatus that is built up is the most successful early initiative to do so of any realm of government, I think, in America at the time. We copied the system from the Germans. but we do so very rapidly, and in some ways we outdo them because we also have a parallel system of private enterprise doing similar types of initiatives, whether it's in cotton or in other crops. There are these private empires like David Coker at the time and Delta Pinelands in Mississippi that are doing very interesting work in parallel with the work done by the government. So I think it is quite important, not only in the short run, but over the long haul in building state capacity to support, sustain, underpin, and reinforce the agricultural modernization. And we do so, I think, in ways that are incredibly quick and lasting. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy the debate later on, I guess, tonight.